The plates were still on the table when Daniel Marsh looked at his wife and said, in front of 6 guests, that she should learn to cook something other than plain rice and chicken. Claire Dawson did not answer. She simply stood up, collected the dishes, and walked into the kitchen with her head low, as she had done 100 times before. Nobody at the table noticed the way her hands trembled as she set the plates in the sink. Nobody except a man sitting quietly near the end of the table, a guest none of them knew well, who watched her leave the room and felt something twist inside his chest. Claire had been married to Daniel for 7 years. In the beginning, there had been small kindnesses, soft words, a warmth that made her believe she had found a partner for life. But somewhere between the wedding and the mortgage, between the long work hours and the silent dinners, that warmth had cooled into something else. Daniel no longer looked at her when she spoke. He no longer asked about her day. He came home, ate what she prepared, scrolled through his phone, and went to sleep without a single word of thanks. She told herself it was normal. She told herself that every marriage settled into routine, that love simply changed shape over the years. But deep down, in the quiet moments before sleep, she knew this was not the same as changing shape. This was disappearing. She was disappearing, piece by piece, inside her own home. That evening, the dinner party had been Daniel's idea, a gathering of his colleagues from the construction firm where he worked as a site manager. Claire had spent 2 days preparing the meal, cleaning the house, choosing the right tablecloth, making sure everything looked perfect. She wanted in some small way to be noticed, to hear him say just once that she had done well. Instead, he had criticized her cooking in front of strangers and laughed when one of his colleagues joined in. In the kitchen, Claire pressed her palms against the cool edge of the sink and breathed slowly, trying to push down the sting in her throat. She had learned, over the years, how to make herself small in moments like this. How to fold her hurt into a tight package and carry it quietly, so no one would see the weight of it. A soft knock came at the kitchen doorway. She turned, expecting Daniel, ready to apologize for something she had not even done wrong. Instead, she found the quiet guest, the one who had said very little all evening, standing there with an empty water glass in his hand. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I just wanted to say the meal was wonderful, truly. I don't think I've had food this good in a long time." Claire blinked, unsure how to respond. Compliments had become foreign to her, like words in a language she used to speak fluently but had since forgotten. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." "I mean it," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "The seasoning on the chicken, the way you balance the spices, that takes real skill. Anyone who says otherwise doesn't know good food." There was something in the way he said it, not flirtatious, not exaggerated, just honest, that made Claire's chest loosen slightly. She studied him for a moment. He was tall, with dark hair combed neatly back, dressed simply but well, and there was a calm steadiness in his eyes that felt unfamiliar in her house, where everything usually moved too fast or too coldly. "I don't think we've properly met," she said. "I'm Claire." "Victor," he said, extending his hand. "Victor Hale. I work with Daniel, though not for very long. I only started at the firm a few months ago." "Well, Victor, thank you for saying something kind. It's been a long time since anyone did." The words slipped out before she could stop them, more honest than she intended. Victor's expression softened, but he did not press her further. He simply nodded, as though he understood more than she had said. "Then I'll make sure to say it more often," he replied, and there was the faintest smile on his face before he turned and walked back toward the dining room, leaving Claire standing alone with her hands still damp from the dishwater, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. The rest of the evening passed the way it always did. Daniel entertained his colleagues, told stories that made everyone laugh, and barely glanced in Claire's direction unless he needed something refilled. She moved through the rooms like a shadow, pouring drinks, clearing plates, smiling politely when spoken to. It was a role she had perfected over the years, the role of the quiet, agreeable wife who asked for nothing and expected even less. But that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt someone's eyes on her that were not filled with indifference. Every so often, she caught Victor watching her from across the room, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her feel, briefly, like a person again rather than a fixture in someone else's life. When the guests finally left, Daniel flopped onto the couch with a satisfied sigh, congratulating himself on how well the evening had gone. Claire began clearing the last of the glasses in silence. "You could have made a better effort with the rice," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "Greg's wife makes this amazing saffron rice. You should ask her for the recipe sometime." Claire paused, glass in hand, and looked at her husband. He did not look back. He never did anymore. She thought about telling him what Victor had said in the kitchen, how a stranger had noticed her effort more than her own husband ever did. But she knew it would mean nothing to him. It would simply pass through him like water through a closed fist, unnoticed, unfelt. "I'll remember that," she said quietly, and carried the glasses to the kitchen. That night, lying beside Daniel as he slept soundly, Claire stared at the ceiling and thought about the strange lightness she had felt in the kitchen. It was such a small thing, a few sentences from a man she had just met, yet it had stayed with her more than anything Daniel had said in months. She told herself it meant nothing. He was simply a polite guest, someone who knew how to make conversation. That was all. But over the next several days, she found herself thinking about those words more than she wanted to admit. The way his voice had been steady and warm. The way he had looked at her, not through her, the way Daniel so often did. Claire worked as a nurse at the local community clinic, a job she loved despite the long hours and the low pay. It gave her a sense of purpose that had slowly leaked out of every other part of her life. Her patients, at least, thanked her. They noticed when she stayed late to comfort a frightened child, or when she remembered small details about their lives that made them feel cared for. At work, she was not invisible. At work, she mattered. It was at the clinic, 3 days after the dinner party, that she saw Victor again. He walked in holding his shoulder awkwardly, explaining to the receptionist that he had strained it while helping move materials at a job site. When Claire's name was called to assist, and she stepped out to bring him back, she felt a small jolt of surprise seeing his face. "Small town," he said, smiling as she guided him toward the examination room. "Or maybe just bad luck on my part." "Let's hope it's nothing serious," Claire said, trying to keep her tone professional, though she could feel a strange flutter in her chest that she quickly pushed aside. As she checked his shoulder, asking the usual questions about the injury, Victor watched her with quiet attentiveness, the same way he had at the dinner table. He was not the type of man who filled silence with unnecessary talk. He simply observed, and when he spoke, his words carried weight. "You're very good at this," he said, as she gently rotated his arm to check the range of motion. "You explain everything so clearly. I actually understand what's happening, which almost never happens at doctors' offices." Claire allowed herself a small laugh. "That's the job. Half of medicine is making people feel less afraid." "Well, it's working," he said. "I'm not afraid at all." There was something easy about their conversation, something that did not require her to shrink herself or measure her words carefully before speaking. With Daniel, every sentence felt like a performance, a careful negotiation to avoid criticism. With Victor, she simply spoke, and he listened. By the time she finished examining him and explaining the recommended treatment, an hour had somehow passed, though it had felt like only a few minutes. As he stood to leave, Victor paused at the door. "Thank you, Claire," he said. "Not just for the shoulder, for the other night too. I meant what I said. You deserve to hear more good things about yourself." Before she could respond, he was gone, walking out through the clinic doors and into the afternoon light, leaving her standing there with her clipboard pressed against her chest, and her heart beating a little faster than it should have. That evening, Claire drove home slower than usual, replaying the conversation in her mind. She told herself again that it was nothing, a kind word from an acquaintance, a polite gesture between two people who barely knew each other. But she could not deny the way her chest had felt lighter all afternoon, the way she had caught herself smiling at odd moments while filling out patient charts. When she arrived home, Daniel was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of paperwork from the construction site spread out in front of him. He did not look up when she walked in. "There's leftover pasta in the fridge if you want it," he said absently. "I already ate." Claire stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her husband hunched over his papers, utterly absorbed in numbers and blueprints, utterly disconnected from her presence. She thought about how easily Victor had noticed her, in a room full of strangers, in a clinic full of patients, while the man she had promised her life to could not even lift his eyes from a spreadsheet. She said nothing. She simply walked to the kitchen, warmed the leftover pasta, and ate alone at the counter, listening to the faint scratch of Daniel's pen against paper in the next room, the sound of a marriage running quietly out of time. Later that night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling once more, Claire allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine what it might feel like to be truly seen every single day. Not just noticed in passing, not just tolerated as a fixture of the household, but actually seen, the way Victor had looked at her across the dinner table, the way his voice had softened when he spoke to her at the clinic. She pushed the thought away quickly, ashamed of herself for even entertaining it. She was a married woman. She had made vows. Whatever Daniel had become, whatever coldness had settled between them, she owed him loyalty, didn't she? She turned onto her side, closed her eyes, and tried to sleep, but the warmth of Victor's words lingered in her mind long after the house had gone quiet, a small ember glowing in a place that had been cold and dark for far too long. Neither of them could have known, that night, how much that small ember would eventually grow, or how it would reveal the truth about a marriage that had been slowly dying in silence for years, waiting only for someone to finally notice the woman who had always been there. The following week, the town of Millbrook settled into its usual rhythm, the small shops opening at dawn, the church bell ringing at noon, the school children walking home in loud, laughing groups. Claire moved through her days as she always had, splitting her time between the clinic and the house, between patients who needed her and a husband who barely noticed she existed. Yet something had shifted quietly beneath the surface of her routine, and she could not stop thinking about it. Victor Hale had become, without either of them planning it, a small but steady presence in her week. He returned to the clinic twice more for follow-up appointments on his shoulder, though Claire suspected, though she never said it aloud, that his shoulder had healed well before the second visit. Each time, their conversations stretched a little longer than necessary, drifting from medical questions into easy, unhurried talk about books, about the town, about small things that somehow felt important when he was the one listening. "You read a lot," Victor observed one afternoon, noticing a worn paperback tucked into the side pocket of her scrub bag. "It's my escape," Claire admitted, a little embarrassed. "When things get quiet at home, I read. It's easier than talking sometimes." "What are you escaping from?" he asked, his tone gentle, not prying, simply curious. Claire hesitated. She was not used to being asked questions that required real answers. Daniel never asked about her inner world anymore, if he ever truly had. "I suppose I'm escaping from feeling invisible," she said finally, surprising herself with her own honesty. "It sounds silly." "It doesn't sound silly at all," Victor said, his voice quiet but firm. "It sounds like something no one should have to feel, especially not in their own home." The words settled over her like a warm blanket, and for a moment she simply looked at him, unable to find a response. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding, the kind of understanding she had stopped expecting from anyone. Their meetings did not stop at the clinic. Millbrook was a small town, and it was not long before their paths crossed elsewhere. Victor began stopping by the small coffee shop on Main Street around the same time Claire took her lunch break, a coincidence that neither of them acknowledged out loud, though both of them silently welcomed it. They would sit at the corner table by the window, sharing sandwiches and quiet conversation, and for those 30 minutes each day, Claire felt like herself again, not a wife performing a role, not a nurse managing a dozen tasks at once, simply Claire, a woman with thoughts and feelings that mattered to someone. "Tell me something about yourself that most people don't know," Victor said one afternoon, stirring his coffee absently. Claire thought for a moment. "I wanted to be a painter when I was younger, before nursing school, before everything else." I used to fill notebooks with sketches. Do you still paint? She shook her head. There hasn't been time, or maybe I just stopped believing it mattered. Victor set down his cup and looked at her directly. It matters. Whatever makes you feel alive matters, Claire. You shouldn't have to give that up just because life got busy. No one had spoken to her like that in years. Daniel had never asked about her old sketchbooks, had never wondered what dreams she might have buried beneath the responsibilities of their marriage. He knew her as a wife who cooked and cleaned and worked a steady job, but he did not know her, not really, not the way Victor seemed to, after only a handful of conversations. Claire began to notice small changes in herself. She stood a little straighter. She laughed more easily. She caught herself daydreaming during quiet moments at the clinic, replaying conversations from the coffee shop, smiling at things Victor had said. She told herself, again and again, that this was simply friendship, that there was nothing wrong with enjoying someone's company, that she was allowed to feel appreciated without it meaning anything more. But deep down, in the honest corners of her heart she rarely visited, she knew the truth was more complicated than that. At home, Daniel remained largely unchanged. He worked long hours at the construction site, often coming home exhausted and irritable, more interested in his phone or the television than in anything Claire had to say. Dinner conversations, when they happened at all, revolved around his frustrations at work, his complaints about difficult clients, his opinions on matters that had nothing to do with her. She listened, as she always had, nodding at the right moments, offering sympathy he barely acknowledged. One evening, as she set his plate down in front of him, Daniel glanced up briefly and frowned. "You seem different lately," he said, though his tone carried more suspicion than curiosity. "Lighter or something, did something happen?" Claire's heart skipped, though she kept her expression calm. "Nothing happened," she said. "Maybe I'm just in a good mood." Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then shrugged and returned his attention to his phone, the passing observation already forgotten. It was such a small moment, barely a ripple in the surface of their evening, but it planted the first tiny seed of something that would, in time, grow into a storm neither of them could control. Claire's friendship with Victor continued to deepen over the following weeks, always within careful boundaries she set for herself. She reminded herself constantly that she was a married woman, that whatever warmth she felt in Victor's presence had to remain simple, harmless, nothing more than a pleasant distraction from a difficult marriage. But the boundaries, however firm she believed them to be, grew thinner each time they spoke. One Saturday afternoon, Claire ran into Victor at the town's small public library, both of them reaching for the same book on the new releases shelf. They laughed at the coincidence, and what began as a brief exchange turned into 2 hours spent wandering between the shelves, recommending books to one another, sharing opinions on stories they had both read years ago. "You have wonderful taste," Victor said, holding up a worn copy of a novel Claire had suggested. "I think I've been missing out on a lot of good books." "You strike me as someone who reads for facts, not stories," Claire teased. "Maybe you're changing that about me," he said, and though his tone was light, there was something underneath it, something Claire chose not to examine too closely. They ended up sitting at a small table near the library's back window, the afternoon light slanting gently across the pages of the books between them. Victor told her about his life before Millbrook, about a difficult divorce that had brought him to the town 2 years earlier, about how he had thrown himself into work to avoid feeling the emptiness that followed. Claire found herself sharing more than she intended, about her early dreams of becoming an artist, about the slow erosion of affection in her marriage, about the loneliness that had settled into her chest like a permanent resident. "I used to think loneliness only happened to people who were alone," she admitted quietly. "I didn't realize you could feel just as lonely standing right next to someone." Victor reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she felt the warmth of the gesture. "You deserve better than that, Claire." "Everyone does." They sat there for a long moment, the noise of the library fading into the background, and Claire felt something inside her chest that she had not felt in years, A fragile, dangerous hope that maybe, somewhere, someone truly saw her. She left the library that afternoon with her heart racing, torn between guilt and gratitude, between loyalty to a marriage that had long stopped nourishing her, and the undeniable pull toward a connection that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely alive. That night, as she prepared dinner, Daniel walked into the kitchen holding his phone, his brow furrowed. "Greg mentioned something odd today," he said, leaning against the counter. "Said his wife saw you at the library with some guy. Sitting real close, talking for hours." Claire's hands stilled over the cutting board for only a fraction of a second before she resumed chopping vegetables, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "That was Victor, from your work. We ran into each other, that's all. We talked about books." "For 2 hours." Daniel's tone was not quite accusing yet, more curious than angry, but there was an edge to it that had not been there before. "He's a friend," Claire said simply. "I don't have many of those these days." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his face, before he shrugged and turned away, muttering something about needing to shower before dinner. Claire exhaled slowly, relieved the conversation had ended, though a small, uneasy feeling settled in her stomach, a quiet warning that things were beginning to shift in ways she could not yet fully understand. Over the following days, Claire noticed Daniel watching her more closely than usual. He asked about her schedule with a frequency that felt unfamiliar, wanted to know when she would be home, questioned small details he had never cared about before. It was not concern, not exactly. It was something closer to suspicion, a low hum of unease that had begun to vibrate beneath the surface of their household. She told herself it would pass, that Daniel's momentary interest was simply a passing mood, unrelated to anything real. She continued seeing Victor, careful to keep their meetings innocent, careful to remind herself, and him, that nothing improper was happening between them. Yet even as she repeated this to herself, she could feel the ground beneath her shifting, the quiet architecture of her marriage beginning to crack under the weight of a truth neither she nor Daniel was ready to face. One evening, as she returned home slightly later than usual after another chance meeting with Victor at the coffee shop, she found Daniel sitting in the darkened living room, the television off, his phone resting untouched on the table beside him. He looked up as she entered, his eyes searching her face in a way that made her stomach tighten. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice quieter than she expected, stripped of its usual indifference. "I told you I stopped for coffee after my shift," Claire replied, trying to keep her tone light despite the sudden tension in the room. "With him again." Claire hesitated, caught between honesty and the instinct to protect something she was not yet ready to name, even to herself. "Yes," she said finally. "With Victor. We're friends, Daniel, that's all it is." Daniel said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tightening, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. Then, without another word, he stood and walked past her toward the bedroom, leaving Claire standing alone in the dim living room, her heart pounding, a strange mixture of guilt and defiance swirling inside her chest. She did not yet know it, but the quiet, careful world she had built between her marriage and her growing friendship with Victor was about to collide in ways that would change everything. And the man who had spent years looking past her was, for the first time, beginning to truly see her, not out of love, but out of the sharp, uncomfortable sting of jealousy taking root in his chest. 2 weeks passed, and the small cracks in Daniel's indifference widened into something he could no longer ignore. He had never been a man who paid close attention to feelings, his own or anyone else's, but the unfamiliar tightness in his chest whenever he thought of Claire spending time with Victor Hale refused to fade, no matter how many times he told himself it was nothing. He began arriving home earlier from the construction site, something he had not done in years, offering vague excuses about slow days or finished projects. Claire noticed the change immediately, though she said nothing, unsure whether to feel relieved or wary. On the surface, it looked like Daniel was simply spending more time at home. Underneath, it was something closer to surveillance, though neither of them named it that way yet. "You're back early again," Claire said one evening, glancing up from the stove as he walked through the door. "Wanted to see my wife," Daniel replied, though the words came out stiff, unnatural, as though he were trying on a role he had forgotten how to play. Claire studied him for a moment, searching his face for some sign of the change, but found only the same tired, unreadable expression he always wore. She turned back to the stove, uncertain what to make of this sudden shift, and continued preparing dinner in silence. At the construction site, Daniel found himself watching Victor with a new, uncomfortable awareness. Victor worked as a project coordinator, overseeing schedules and communicating with clients, a position that occasionally brought him into contact with Daniel's team. Before, Daniel had barely registered the man's presence, exchanging little more than professional pleasantries when their paths crossed. Now every interaction felt charged. Every friendly comment from Victor to a coworker felt, in Daniel's mind, like something aimed at him personally. "You seem tense lately," Greg, one of Daniel's longtime colleagues, remarked one afternoon as they reviewed blueprints together. "Everything all right at home?" Daniel shrugged, unwilling to admit the truth even to himself. "Fine, just tired." But Greg, who had known Daniel for nearly a decade, was not easily fooled. This wouldn't have anything to do with Victor spending so much time with Claire, would it? Daniel's jaw tightened at the mention of the name, a reaction so immediate and involuntary that it surprised even him. "They're friends," he said, echoing Claire's own words, though his tone carried none of her calm conviction. "That's what she says, anyway." Greg raised an eyebrow but said nothing further, sensing the tension simmering beneath his friend's clipped response. The conversation ended there, but the seed of doubt Greg had unknowingly watered continued to grow in Daniel's mind throughout the rest of the day, distracting him from his work, gnawing at the edges of his concentration. That evening, Daniel found himself scrolling through Claire's social media profile, something he had not bothered to do in years. He told himself he was simply curious, that there was nothing wrong with checking in on his own wife's online presence. But as he scrolled, his stomach tightened with each photo he found, innocent images from community events. A picture of Claire smiling at the coffee shop with a cup in hand, another from the library with several books stacked on the table in front of her. None of the photos included Victor directly, yet Daniel could not shake the feeling that the man's presence lingered just outside the frame of every image, an invisible shadow he could sense but not quite see. He set the phone down, frustrated with himself for the unfamiliar churning in his gut, and told himself once again that he was overreacting. Claire had always been faithful, always reliable, always exactly where she said she would be. There was no reason to doubt her now. And yet the doubt remained, quiet and persistent, refusing to be reasoned away. Meanwhile, Claire's friendship with Victor continued to deepen, though she grew increasingly careful about when and where they met, sensing, without fully admitting it to herself, that Daniel's attention had shifted in ways that made her uneasy. She still met Victor occasionally at the coffee shop, though less frequently now, and their conversations, while still warm, carried a new undercurrent of caution. "You seem distracted today," Victor observed one afternoon, noticing the way Claire kept glancing toward the window, as though expecting to see someone watching from outside. "Daniel's been different lately," Claire admitted, stirring her coffee absently, "more attentive in a strange way. I don't know how to explain it. It doesn't feel like it used to." "Does that worry you?" Claire considered the question carefully before answering. "I think it worries me because I don't know if it's real, whether he's actually trying to be a better husband or whether it's something else." Victor was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Whatever it is, Claire, you deserve honesty, from him and from yourself too." The words lingered with her long after their conversation ended, a quiet challenge she was not yet ready to fully confront. She drove home that afternoon turning the question over in her mind, wondering what it truly meant to be honest with herself about a marriage that had grown so complicated, so tangled between old loyalty and new possibility. That weekend, the town of Millbrook held its annual Harvest Festival, a tradition Claire had always enjoyed, with its rows of food stalls, live music, and the warm, communal energy that seemed to bring the entire town together for one bright afternoon each year. Daniel had insisted on attending together, an unusual request that Claire accepted with cautious optimism, hoping it might be a genuine step toward repairing the distance between them. The festival grounds were crowded, filled with the smell of roasted corn and fresh bread, the sound of a local band playing somewhere near the center of the square. Daniel walked close beside Claire, his hand resting lightly on her back, a gesture so unfamiliar that she nearly flinched at the contact before allowing herself to relax into it, cautiously hopeful that something between them might finally be shifting for the better. But the fragile peace of the afternoon shattered the moment they rounded a corner near the craft stalls and found Victor standing there, laughing with a small group of neighbors, his easy smile visible even from a distance. Claire felt her stomach drop, though she quickly composed herself, offering a polite wave as they approached. "Claire, Daniel," Victor greeted them warmly, his tone entirely innocent, unaware of the tension already coiling in Daniel's chest. "Good to see you both here." "Victor," Daniel said, his voice flat, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the easy familiarity with which Victor addressed his wife. The conversation that followed was brief, filled with the polite small talk typical of a chance encounter at a community event, but Daniel remained silent for most of it, his eyes flicking between Claire and Victor with an intensity that made Claire increasingly uncomfortable. When Victor mentioned, in passing, a recommendation for a book he thought Claire would enjoy, referencing a conversation they had clearly had before, Daniel's expression darkened further. "You two talk about books often?" Daniel asked, his tone carrying an edge that had not been there moments before. "We've run into each other at the library a few times," Victor replied easily, still unaware of the shift in the atmosphere. "Claire has excellent taste." Daniel said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his wife in a way that made her chest tighten with a mixture of guilt and defensiveness she could not quite reconcile. The conversation ended shortly after, Victor excusing himself to rejoin his neighbors, leaving Claire and Daniel standing alone amid the noise and color of the festival, a silence stretching between them that felt far colder than the crisp autumn air. "You never mentioned running into him at the library," Daniel said finally, his voice low. "It wasn't a secret, Daniel. It just wasn't something worth mentioning. We're friends, that's all." "Friends who apparently talk enough to know each other's taste in books," Daniel muttered, and though he tried to keep his tone even, the bitterness beneath it was impossible to miss. Claire felt a flare of frustration rise within her, sharp and unexpected. "Would it matter to you if we were more than friends, Daniel? Because for years, you barely noticed whether I was in the same room as you. And now, the moment someone else pays attention to me, suddenly you care." The words hung in the air between them, harsher than she had intended, but true nonetheless, a truth she had been carrying silently for far too long. Daniel's face went pale, then flushed with something between anger and shame, though he said nothing in response, simply turning and walking ahead of her through the crowded festival grounds, leaving her to follow several paces behind, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had just said aloud for the first time. They drove home in silence, the tension between them thick and unspoken, filling the car like a heavy fog neither of them knew how to clear. When they arrived home, Daniel disappeared into the garage without a word, and Claire retreated to the bedroom, sitting alone on the edge of the bed, replaying the events of the afternoon in her mind. She had not meant to say those words so bluntly, had not intended to expose the raw truth of her loneliness in the middle of a crowded festival. But now that the words were spoken, she felt a strange, unfamiliar relief, as though a weight she had carried for years had finally been set down, even if only partially. Later that night, after hours of silence between them, Daniel appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I didn't realize you felt that way," he said quietly. "About feeling invisible, I thought. I don't know what I thought. That things were fine, I suppose, that you were happy enough." Claire looked up at him, surprised by the uncertainty in his voice, so different from his usual confident tone. "I haven't been happy in a long time, Daniel. Not because you did anything cruel, just because you stopped seeing me, stopped noticing me at all. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his hands hanging awkwardly at his sides, clearly unsure how to respond to a vulnerability so foreign to him. "I don't know how to fix that," he admitted finally. "I don't even know where to start." "Maybe start by actually listening," Claire said softly. "Not because you're afraid of losing me to someone else, but because you want to know me again." Daniel nodded slowly, though the doubt remained visible in his eyes. A doubt Claire shared as well, uncertain whether this sudden willingness to change stemmed from genuine reflection or simply fear of losing something he had taken for granted for far too long. As she turned off the bedroom light that night, she wondered which version of Daniel would emerge in the days ahead. The man finally ready to see her, or the man simply desperate to keep what he feared losing, without truly understanding what he had nearly thrown away. In the days that followed the Harvest Festival, Daniel Marsh became a man consumed by a feeling he barely understood. Jealousy, once a foreign concept to him, had settled into his chest like an uninvited guest, refusing to leave no matter how hard he tried to reason it away. He found himself replaying the scene at the festival over and over, the easy way Victor had spoken to Claire, the familiarity in their exchange, the flash of something warm in his wife's eyes that he could not remember seeing directed at him in years. At work, his focus splintered. He snapped at his crew over minor mistakes, lost his train of thought during client calls, and found himself, more than once, staring blankly at blueprints without absorbing a single detail. Greg noticed the change immediately, though he chose his words carefully when he finally addressed it. "You've been off all week," Greg said, joining Daniel during a break near the site's makeshift lunch area. "This is about Victor and Claire, isn't it?" Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what it's about anymore. I keep telling myself nothing's happening, but then I see them together and something in me just snaps." "Have you talked to her about it? Really talked, not just accused her?" Daniel hesitated, memories of the tense drive home from the festival resurfacing in his mind. "I tried, sort of. She said some things that hit harder than I expected." "Like what?" "That I stopped seeing her a long time ago," Daniel admitted quietly, the words feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. "That I only started paying attention because someone else did first." Greg studied his friend for a long moment before responding. "Is she wrong?" The question landed with unexpected force, and Daniel found himself unable to answer immediately, the truth of it settling uncomfortably in his chest. He thought back over the past several years, trying to recall the last time he had truly listened to Claire, the last time he had asked about her dreams, her fears, the quiet details of her inner life. He came up empty, memory after memory blurring into the same routine of silent dinners and distracted evenings, and the realization left him feeling hollow in a way he had not expected. "No," he admitted finally. "She's not wrong." That evening, Daniel arrived home earlier than usual, determined to make some kind of gesture, however small, toward the change Claire had asked for. He stopped at a small flower shop on the way, an act so unfamiliar that the shop owner, an elderly woman named Margaret, commented on how long it had been since she had seen him in the store. "Special occasion?" Margaret asked, wrapping a bouquet of white lilies in simple brown paper. "No occasion," Daniel replied, feeling oddly exposed by the question. "Just trying to remember how to be a better husband." Margaret smiled knowingly, handing him the flowers. "That's the best kind of gift there is." "Better late than never, dear." When Claire arrived home from her shift that evening, she found the flowers sitting on the kitchen table, along with a simple note in Daniel's handwriting that read, "I know sorry isn't enough, but I want to try." She stood there for a long moment, staring at the unfamiliar gesture, uncertain how to feel. Part of her wanted to believe this was the beginning of real change, a genuine effort from a man finally waking up to what he had been neglecting. But another part of her, the part hardened by years of disappointment, wondered whether this was simply fear disguised as affection, a reaction to jealousy rather than a true desire to see her. Daniel emerged from the living room as she stood by the table, his expression uncertain, almost boyish in its vulnerability. "I know it's not much," he said, "but I wanted to start somewhere." "They're beautiful," Claire said softly, though her voice carried a note of caution she could not quite hide. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Daniel continued, sitting down at the table and gesturing for her to join him. "About feeling invisible. I hate that I made you feel that way, Claire. I really do. I got comfortable, I think. Comfortable in a way that made me stop trying." Claire sat across from him, studying his face carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the words. "Comfortable isn't an excuse, Daniel. But I appreciate you saying it." "I want to do better," he said. "I want to actually know you again, ask me something, anything. I want to prove I'm listening." Claire considered the request for a long moment, unsure where to begin after years of silence between them. "What do you think I dream about?" she asked finally. "Not for us, for myself. What do you think I want out of my own life?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, the question catching him entirely off guard. He realized, with a growing sense of shame, that he genuinely did not know. He knew she worked as a nurse, knew she was skilled and dedicated, but beyond the surface details of her daily routine, he could not name a single dream she carried for herself. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I should know that, and I don't." "You used to know I wanted to paint," Claire said, her voice gentle but firm. "Do you remember that?" Daniel searched his memory and found, to his relief, a faint recollection surfacing, an old notebook filled with sketches he had seen once years ago, before it had disappeared into a closet somewhere, forgotten along with so many other pieces of the woman he had married. "The sketchbooks," he said slowly. "I remember now. You used to draw all the time before we got married." "I stopped," Claire said. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped believing it mattered to anyone, including myself." Daniel reached across the table, hesitating slightly before taking her hand, an action that felt both familiar and strange after so much distance had grown between them. "It matters," he said. "I want it to matter again, to both of us." For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they talked late into the evening, not about work schedules or household chores, but about the people they had been before the weight of routine had settled over their marriage. Claire found herself cautiously hopeful, though the memory of Victor's steady attentiveness lingered in the back of her mind, an unspoken presence neither of them addressed directly. Over the following days, Daniel made small but consistent efforts, arriving home on time, asking genuine questions about her day, even suggesting they revisit an old hobby together, something they had abandoned years earlier. It was clumsy at times, awkward in the way that unfamiliar kindness often is, but Claire could not deny that something in him seemed to be shifting, however tentatively. Yet even as Daniel worked to rebuild the connection between them, the jealousy that had first sparked his change had not entirely faded. He found himself asking, more frequently than felt natural, whether Claire had spoken to Victor recently, whether their paths had crossed at the clinic or around town. The questions were subtle at first, disguised as casual curiosity, but Claire recognized the underlying anxiety behind them, the fear that his newfound attentiveness was still tangled up with insecurity rather than pure, selfless love. "You don't have to worry about Victor," Claire told him one evening, sensing the tension behind his latest question about her day. "Nothing happened between us, Daniel, nothing improper ever. He was simply kind to me when I needed it." "I know," Daniel said, though his tone carried a trace of uncertainty. I don't want to lose you, Claire, now that I finally understand what I almost lost." Claire studied her husband carefully, weighing the sincerity of his words against the fear that seemed to drive them. She wanted, more than anything, to believe that his change was rooted in genuine love rather than the sharp sting of jealousy. But a part of her remained cautious, unwilling to fully surrender her guard after years of neglect. Meanwhile, Victor noticed the shift in Claire's demeanor over the following weeks, the way she seemed both hopeful and hesitant whenever their paths crossed. Their meetings grew less frequent, though the warmth between them remained, An unspoken connection neither of them was quite ready to name or release entirely. "You seem happier," Victor observed one afternoon, when Claire stopped briefly at the coffee shop, her schedule now filled with the small efforts of a marriage trying, tentatively, to rebuild itself. "Daniel's trying," Claire admitted. "Really trying, I think. It's strange after everything." Victor's expression remained carefully neutral, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of feelings he had never openly expressed. "I'm glad," he said, and though his voice was sincere, there was a faint trace of something else beneath it, something Claire chose not to examine too closely. "Thank you, Victor," she said softly, "for everything, for seeing me when I needed it most." "You never needed me to see you, Claire," he replied gently. "You just needed someone to remind you that you were always worth seeing." The words settled over her like a quiet blessing, and as she left the coffee shop that afternoon, walking back toward the clinic beneath the pale autumn sky, Claire found herself caught between two paths, one leading toward the slow, uncertain rebuilding of a marriage that had nearly been lost, and another leading toward a connection that had reminded her, in her darkest moments of loneliness, exactly what it felt like to be truly seen. Neither path was without risk, and neither choice would come without cost, but for the first time in years, Claire understood that the decision, ultimately, belonged entirely to her. Winter arrived early in Millbrook that year, dusting the rooftops with a light frost that clung stubbornly through the mornings. Claire found herself settling into a fragile new rhythm at home, one where Daniel's efforts, though still uneven, had become a steady presence rather than a passing phase. He remembered small details now, the name of her favorite patient at the clinic, the anniversary of her mother's passing, the way she preferred her coffee slightly sweeter in the colder months. It was not a perfect transformation, but it was real, and Claire allowed herself, cautiously, to lean into the possibility that her marriage might yet be saved. Still, the presence of Victor Hale lingered at the edges of their lives, an unspoken variable neither Claire nor Daniel had fully resolved. Their paths continued to cross occasionally, at the clinic, around town, at the small gatherings that made up the fabric of Millbrook's close-knit community. Each encounter, however brief, sent a flicker of unease through Daniel, a reminder of how close he had come to losing something he had only recently begun to appreciate. One cold evening in late November, the construction firm held its annual holiday gathering, a modest event held at a rented hall on the edge of town, complete with string lights, a simple buffet, and the kind of forced cheer common to workplace celebrations. Daniel had insisted Claire attend with him, eager to show off the renewed warmth between them, though Claire agreed with a quiet apprehension she could not fully explain. The hall was crowded when they arrived, filled with familiar faces from Daniel's crew and their families, the low hum of conversation blending with soft holiday music playing from speakers near the makeshift stage. Claire scanned the room instinctively, and though she told herself she was not looking for anyone in particular, her chest tightened slightly when she spotted Victor near the refreshment table, engaged in easy conversation with a small group of colleagues. Daniel noticed the direction of her gaze immediately, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, though he said nothing, guiding her instead toward a table near the center of the room. Throughout the evening he stayed close by her side, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back, a gesture that felt, to Claire, less like affection and more like quiet possession. As the evening wore on, Greg approached their table, a warm smile on his face, clearly unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Claire, it's good to see you. Daniel's been in a much better mood lately, you know. Must be your influence." Claire smiled politely, grateful for the kind words, though she noticed Daniel's expression tighten further at the mention of his own recent change, as though the reminder of his previous coldness stung more than he wanted to admit. Before she could respond, Victor approached the table as well, drawn by the sound of familiar voices. "Claire, Daniel," Victor greeted them, his tone friendly and entirely unaware of the storm quietly brewing beneath the surface. "Good to see you both here." "Victor," Daniel replied, his voice clipped, the warmth he had shown moments earlier evaporating entirely. The conversation that followed remained polite on the surface, filled with the usual exchanges of holiday pleasantries, but Claire could feel the tension radiating from her husband with every passing second. When Victor mentioned, casually, that he hoped Claire would find time to visit the library again soon, as a new shipment of books had recently arrived, Daniel's composure finally cracked. "She's been busy," Daniel said sharply, cutting into the conversation before Claire could respond. "With her husband at home. Where she belongs." The words landed like a slap, harsh and unexpected, drawing startled glances from those nearby. Claire felt her face flush with embarrassment, mortified by the sudden hostility in Daniel's tone, while Victor's expression shifted from confusion to quiet understanding, the underlying tension finally rising to the surface for everyone to see. "Daniel," Claire said quietly, her voice tight with warning, "that's enough." But Daniel, fueled by weeks of simmering insecurity finally boiling over, was not ready to stop. "Is it, though? Because every time I turn around you're mentioning books or coffee or some new thing you two have in common. I'm trying here, Claire. I'm really trying. And it feels like no matter what I do, he's still somehow in the middle of everything." The hall had grown quieter around them, several nearby guests pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word. Claire's embarrassment quickly shifted into anger, sharp and immediate, at being spoken about as though she were a possession rather than a person capable of making her own choices. "You don't get to speak about me like I'm not standing right here," she said, her voice low but firm, carrying clearly despite the quiet hum of the room. "And you certainly don't get to speak to Victor that way. He's done nothing wrong." Victor, sensing the escalating tension, raised his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "Daniel, I think there's a misunderstanding here. Claire and I are friends, nothing more. I have never disrespected your marriage, and I never intended to." "Friends," Daniel repeated bitterly, the word tasting sour on his tongue. "Right. Just friends who happen to spend hours together while I'm working, who happen to know each other's taste in books, who happen to run into each other constantly in a town this small." "That's enough," Claire said again, louder this time, her voice trembling slightly with barely contained emotion. "You're humiliating me, Daniel, in front of everyone. Is this what your effort looks like? Watching me, accusing me, making a scene the moment you feel threatened." Daniel's expression faltered, the anger in his eyes flickering briefly into something closer to shame as he registered the small crowd of onlookers, the whispered conversations already beginning around them. But the damage had already been done, the careful progress of the past several weeks unraveling in a matter of minutes under the weight of his unchecked jealousy. Claire did not wait for his response. She turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, leaving Daniel standing frozen amid the murmuring crowd, the holiday music continuing to play cheerfully in stark contrast to the wreckage of the moment. Victor moved to follow her, then hesitated, glancing back at Daniel with an expression that carried more pity than anger. "You should go after her," he said quietly. "Not because of me, because she deserves an apology and she deserves to hear it away from all of this." Daniel stood there for a long moment, humiliation and regret warring within him, before finally pushing through the crowd toward the exit, ignoring the curious glances that followed him. He found Claire standing outside in the cold evening air, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her breath visible in small clouds against the darkness. "Claire," he said softly, approaching carefully, as though she might vanish entirely if he moved too quickly. "I'm sorry, I completely lost control back there. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to Victor either." Claire turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, though her voice remained steady. "Do you understand what you did in there? You didn't just embarrass me, Daniel. You made me feel like a possession again, like something to be guarded rather than someone to be loved. That's exactly the kind of feeling I've been trying to escape for years." "I know," Daniel said, his voice thick with genuine remorse. "I let the jealousy take over. I've been so afraid of losing you that I forgot how to actually treat you like someone worth keeping." "Being afraid of losing someone isn't the same as loving them," Claire said quietly. I need you to understand that difference, Daniel. Because right now, I don't know which one is driving all of this. Your fear or something real. Daniel stood silently for a long moment, the cold night air settling around them before finally speaking again, his voice quieter and more honest than she had heard in years. I don't know either if I'm being completely truthful, but I know I don't want to be the man who drove you away because he couldn't control his own insecurity. I want to be better than that, Claire. I want to earn the chance to prove it, even if it takes time. Claire studied her husband carefully, searching his face for the truth behind his words, uncertain whether this moment marked a genuine turning point or simply another chapter in a pattern of temporary remorse followed by eventual relapse. She did not have an answer, not yet, but she understood, standing there in the cold beneath the distant hum of holiday music drifting from the hall behind them, that the choice before her had grown far more complicated than she had ever anticipated, and that whatever came next would require more honesty, from both of them, than either had shown in years. They drove home in silence once again, though this silence carried a different weight than before, heavier with unresolved questions neither of them was ready to answer. As Claire lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept restlessly beside her, she found herself thinking not of anger, nor even of Victor's steady kindness, but of the quiet, unsettling truth that a marriage built on fear of loss could never truly replace one built on genuine understanding, no matter how sincere the effort behind it might eventually become. The days following the holiday gathering settled into an uneasy quiet between Claire and Daniel, neither of them quite willing to reopen the wound that had torn open so publicly in front of his colleagues. Word of the confrontation had, predictably, spread through the small circle of coworkers and their families, and Claire found herself enduring sympathetic glances at the grocery store, careful silences from Daniel's colleagues' wives at the clinic, the particular kind of attention that came from being, however unwillingly, the subject of small-town gossip. Daniel, for his part, seemed genuinely shaken by the incident, more so than Claire had expected. The bravado that had carried him through years of quiet neglect had cracked, revealing something rower and more uncertain beneath it. He began seeing a counselor, a decision he made without prompting from Claire, driving 40 minutes to the neighboring town of Ashford each Tuesday evening to meet with a therapist who specialized in marriage and individual counseling. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man who needed this," Daniel admitted one evening, several weeks after his first session, as they sat together at the kitchen table. "But Dr. Ellison helped me understand something. I think I've spent so many years building walls around myself, at work, at home, that I forgot how to actually let anyone in, including you." Claire listened carefully, cautiously allowing herself to hope that this reflection ran deeper than the temporary remorse of a man afraid of losing his wife. "What else did you talk about?" she asked gently. "My father," Daniel said quietly, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. "How he never told my mother he loved her, not once that I can remember. How affection in our house always felt like weakness, something to avoid rather than something to give freely. I think I absorbed that without ever realizing it. I thought providing for you was enough. I never understood that you needed more than that." The vulnerability in his voice was unfamiliar, almost startling in its honesty, and Claire found herself reaching across the table to take his hand, a small gesture that felt, for the first time in months, entirely genuine rather than cautious. "Thank you for telling me that," she said softly. "It helps, knowing where some of this comes from." "It doesn't excuse what I did at the party," Daniel said quickly. "Nothing excuses that. I humiliated you, and I humiliated myself, and I need you to know I understand that." "I appreciate you saying that," Claire replied. "But understanding it and changing it are two different things, Daniel. I need to see the change, not just hear about it." "I know," he said. "I'm asking for the chance to show you, however long that takes." Over the following weeks, Daniel's efforts took on a new consistency, less driven by the sharp panic of jealousy and more grounded in the steady work of genuine reflection. He continued his counseling sessions, began reading books Dr. Ellison recommended on emotional communication, and made a conscious effort to ask Claire about her day without immediately steering the conversation back toward himself. It was slow, imperfect progress, filled with moments of old habits resurfacing, but Claire noticed, gradually, that his questions began to carry genuine curiosity rather than anxious suspicion. One Saturday afternoon in early December, Daniel surprised her with something she had not expected. She returned home from a rare day off to find the garage transformed, an old folding table set up near the window, a simple easel purchased from the craft store in town, a fresh set of paints and brushes arranged neatly beside a stack of blank canvases. "I remembered what you said," Daniel explained, watching her reaction carefully as she stood in the doorway, stunned into silence. "About painting, about giving up on it because you thought it didn't matter to anyone. I wanted you to know it matters to me, even if I don't understand it the way you do." Claire walked slowly into the garage, running her fingers along the edge of the easel, feeling a lump rise in her throat that she had not expected. It was such a simple gesture, and yet it carried more weight than any grand declaration could have offered, because it required Daniel to remember something specific about her, something that had nothing to do with him at all. "I don't even know if I remember how," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "Then find out," Daniel said gently. "I'll be right here whenever you want to try." That evening, for the first time in nearly a decade, Claire picked up a brush and stood before a blank canvas, Daniel sitting quietly nearby, not offering suggestions or criticism, simply present, watching with genuine interest as she rediscovered a piece of herself she had believed lost forever. The painting that emerged over the following days was imperfect, unpolished after years without practice, but it represented something far more significant than artistic skill, a small, tangible proof that Daniel was finally beginning to see her, not as an extension of his own needs, but as a person with dreams entirely separate from him. Still, despite this progress, the shadow of Victor Hale had not entirely disappeared from their lives, nor from Claire's thoughts. She had not spoken to him since the holiday gathering, deliberately avoiding the coffee shop and library during the hours she knew he was likely to be there, uncertain how to navigate a friendship that had grown so complicated, so entangled with the near collapse of her marriage. It was Victor himself who finally reached out, sending a brief, carefully worded message that arrived on her phone one quiet evening in mid-December. "I hope things are going well for you and Daniel," the message read. "I wanted you to know I have no hard feelings about what happened at the party. I only ever wanted you to know your own worth, Claire. Whatever you decide moving forward, I hope you choose whatever makes you happiest." Claire stared at the message for a long time, sitting alone in the quiet of the bedroom while Daniel worked late in the garage, continuing the small home improvement projects he had recently thrown himself into with unfamiliar enthusiasm. She felt a complicated tangle of emotions reading Victor's words, gratitude for his kindness, sadness at the quiet ending of a friendship that had meant more to her than she had initially realized, and a small, persistent question she could not fully silence about what might have been, had circumstances been different. She typed a brief reply, thanking him for his understanding, wishing him well, and closing the conversation with a gentle finality that felt, despite the ache in her chest, like the right decision. She did not mention the exchange to Daniel, not out of deception, but because she recognized it as something that belonged entirely to her own closure, a chapter she needed to end on her own terms rather than under the shadow of his lingering insecurity. Christmas arrived quietly that year, the small house on Maple Street decorated modestly with lights Daniel had insisted on hanging himself, despite his evident lack of skill with a ladder. Claire watched him from the window, laughing softly as he nearly toppled from the second rung, a moment of ordinary domestic clumsiness that felt, somehow, more precious than any grand romantic gesture could have offered. On Christmas morning, Daniel presented her with a single gift, wrapped simply in brown paper, no elaborate bow or decoration. Claire opened it slowly, finding inside a small leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. "For your thoughts," Daniel explained, watching her reaction carefully. "Or sketches, or whatever you want to fill it with. Dr. Ellison suggested I find ways to encourage the parts of you that exist outside of our marriage. I thought this might help. Claire ran her fingers over the soft leather cover, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes, moved not by the object itself, but by the thoughtfulness behind it, the evidence of genuine effort to understand her as a whole person rather than simply a wife fulfilling a role. "Thank you," she whispered. "This means more than you know." "I mean it, Claire," Daniel said, kneeling beside her chair, his eyes earnest in a way she had not seen in years. "I want to keep learning who you are, not because I'm afraid of losing you to someone else, but because I finally understand how much I nearly lost by not truly knowing you at all." Claire studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of the old fear-driven possessiveness that had fueled his earlier jealousy, and found instead something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in a very long while, like genuine love rather than desperate attachment. She was not naive enough to believe the transformation was complete, aware that old patterns could resurface under stress, that true change required sustained effort over months and years rather than a single season of good intentions. But sitting there on Christmas morning, surrounded by the quiet warmth of a home that finally felt like it belonged to both of them equally, Claire allowed herself, cautiously and honestly, to believe that something real had finally begun to grow between them, planted not in the soil of jealousy, but in the harder, more lasting ground of genuine understanding. Spring arrived in Millbrook slowly, the frost giving way to soft green buds along the maple trees that lined Claire and Daniel Street, and with it came a season of quiet reflection for Claire, who found herself standing at a crossroads she had not fully anticipated. Months had passed since the confrontation at the holiday party, months of steady, if imperfect, effort from Daniel, months of careful rebuilding between two people who had nearly lost each other through years of quiet neglect. Yet even as their marriage found new footing, Claire could not entirely silence the quiet question that lingered in the back of her mind, a question that had first taken root the night Victor Hale complimented her cooking in a kitchen filled with unspoken loneliness. Had she chosen to stay with Daniel because she truly believed in the marriage they were rebuilding, or simply because it was familiar, because leaving felt harder than staying, because the fear of starting over outweighed the quiet ache of unfinished possibility? She found herself turning the question over during quiet moments at the clinic. During the evening hours she now spent painting in the garage, while Daniel puttered nearby with small projects of his own. During the late nights, she filled the pages of her leather journal with thoughts she had never allowed herself to fully examine before. The journal had become, over the months, a private space for honesty, a place where she could admit truths too complicated to speak aloud. "I don't regret the friendship with Victor," she wrote one evening in early April, the pen moving steadily across the page. "He reminded me that I was still someone worth noticing, at a time when I had forgotten that entirely. But I think, if I'm honest with myself, what I felt for him was never really about him. It was about what he represented, someone who saw me clearly, without years of resentment and routine clouding the view. Maybe that could have grown into something more, given different circumstances. But I don't know if that would have been love or simply relief." She closed the journal that night feeling a strange, settled clarity, though the question of her own certainty remained unresolved, waiting for something or someone to help her understand it fully. That clarity arrived, unexpectedly, on a warm afternoon in late April, when Claire ran into Victor at the town's small farmers' market, the first time their paths had crossed since his final message months earlier. He looked well, she noted, more relaxed than she remembered, standing beside a stall selling fresh strawberries, engaged in easy conversation with the vendor. "Claire," he said, his expression brightening with genuine warmth as he spotted her, "it's good to see you." "Victor," she replied, feeling a familiar flutter of nervous energy, though it felt different now, softer, less charged with the uncertainty that had once colored their interactions. "How have you been?" "Good, actually," he said, and something in his tone suggested he meant it sincerely. "I've been seeing someone, actually. Her name is Lauren. She works at the school in Ashford. We met a few months ago, and things have been going well." Claire felt a small, unexpected pang at the news, not quite jealousy, but something adjacent to it, a bittersweet acknowledgement that the door between them, once left tentatively open, had now closed on its own, naturally and without regret. "I'm happy for you, Victor, truly." "And you," he asked, "how are things with Daniel?" Claire considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to give him an honest response rather than a polished one. "Better," she said finally. "Really better, actually. He's been working hard, seeing a counselor, trying to understand where things went wrong for so long. I think, for the first time in years, we're actually building something real instead of just going through the motions." Victor smiled, and this time the warmth in his expression carried no trace of longing, only genuine happiness for her. "I'm glad, Claire. I always hoped, whatever happened, that you would end up somewhere you felt truly valued. That's all I ever wanted for you." "You helped me remember that I deserved that," Claire said softly. "I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that." "You don't need to thank me," Victor replied. "You did the hard work yourself. I just happened to be there at the right moment to remind you of what you already knew, deep down." They talked for a few more minutes, easy and unburdened now, free of the tension that had once hovered around their conversations, before parting ways with a simple, genuine goodbye, the kind exchanged between people who had once meant something significant to each other and had found, through honesty and time, a way to let that meaning settle into something gentler, something closer to gratitude than longing. Claire drove home that afternoon feeling lighter than she had in months, the last lingering uncertainty about her own choices finally settling into place. She understood now, with a clarity she had not possessed during the confusing months of the previous winter, that her connection with Victor had served an important purpose in her life, not as a replacement for her marriage, but as a mirror, a reminder of her own worth that had allowed her to demand better, both from Daniel and from herself. That evening she found Daniel in the garage, standing before her latest painting, a landscape of the maple trees along their street, rendered in soft greens and warm golden light. He turned as she entered, his expression thoughtful. "This is really beautiful, Claire," he said. "I mean that. You have real talent." "Thank you," she said, moving to stand beside him, studying the painting alongside her husband in comfortable silence for a long moment before speaking again. "I ran into Victor today at the farmer's market." Daniel's shoulders tensed slightly at the mention of the name, an old, familiar reflex, though he quickly composed himself, taking a slow breath before responding. "How is he?" "He's seeing someone," Claire said gently. "Her name is Lauren. He seems happy." Relief washed visibly over Daniel's features, though he seemed almost embarrassed by the intensity of it, running a hand through his hair with a rueful smile. "I know I shouldn't still feel that way," he admitted. "The jealousy, I mean. But hearing that does make something in me relax, if I'm being honest." "It's all right to feel that," Claire said. "But I want you to understand something, Daniel. I stayed because I chose to, not because Victor moved on with someone else. Those are two very different things." "I know," Daniel said, his tone earnest. "I've been working hard to understand the difference. Dr. Ellison talks about it a lot, actually, the difference between love that comes from fear of loss and love that comes from genuine appreciation. I think I understand it better now than I did back in December." "Do you?" Claire asked, studying him carefully. "I think so," Daniel said. "I don't want you here because I'm scared of what happens if you're not. I want you here because I've finally started to understand what an incredible person you are, and I want the chance to keep discovering that, for as long as you'll let me." Claire felt the sincerity in his words settle over her, warm and steady, entirely different from the anxious, possessive energy that had characterized his behavior months earlier. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and together they stood in comfortable silence, studying the painting that represented, in its quiet way, everything she had rediscovered about herself over the difficult months since a stranger's kind words in a crowded kitchen had first reminded her that she was worth noticing. "I think," Claire said finally, breaking the silence, "that we're actually going to be all right, Daniel. Not perfect, but all right." "All right is more than I deserved for a long time," Daniel replied quietly. "I'll take it, and I'll keep earning better than all right every single day for as long as it takes." As the spring evening settled softly over Millbrook, filling the garage with the gentle golden light of sunset, Claire understood, with a peace she had not felt in years, that her story had not ended with jealousy, nor with the fleeting warmth of a friendship that had reminded her of her own worth, but with the harder, more meaningful work of two people choosing, deliberately and honestly, to truly see each other at last. A full year passed before Claire truly allowed herself to believe that the changes in her marriage were permanent rather than another passing season of good intentions. She had learned, through painful experience, not to trust transformation too quickly, to watch for the quiet returns of old patterns beneath the surface of new behavior. But as the seasons turned once more toward autumn, bringing with them the anniversary of that first uncomfortable dinner party where Victor Hale had first noticed her in a kitchen full of silence, Claire found herself reflecting on just how far she and Daniel had traveled together. The garage had become, over the months, a genuine shared space rather than simply Claire's private refuge. Daniel had built proper shelving for her growing collection of paintings, had learned enough about color theory and technique from watching her work that he could offer thoughtful, if amateur, observations about her latest pieces. More importantly, he had continued attending his counseling sessions long after the initial crisis had passed, understanding, finally, that genuine change required ongoing maintenance rather than a single dramatic gesture. Their marriage was tested again that autumn, though not by jealousy this time, but by a far more mundane and difficult challenge, a sudden financial strain when the construction firm lost a major contract, leaving Daniel's position uncertain for several tense weeks. In the old version of their marriage, Claire suspected, this stress would have driven Daniel back into silent, distracted withdrawal, leaving her once again to navigate the household's anxiety alone. Instead, he came to her each evening, sharing the details of his worry, asking for her input on their finances, treating her, for the first time in their marriage, as a genuine partner rather than a passive bystander in decisions that affected them both. "I would have handled this so differently a year ago," Daniel admitted one evening, as they sat together reviewing their budget at the kitchen table, the same table where he had once criticized her cooking in front of strangers. "I would have carried all of this alone, probably taken it out on you without even realizing it, and left you wondering what was wrong without ever telling you the truth." "You're telling me now," Claire said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "That matters more than you know." The financial strain eventually resolved itself when Daniel secured a new contract with a firm in Ashford, requiring a longer commute but offering better stability than his previous position. Through the uncertainty, their partnership had held steady, tested by real difficulty rather than manufactured jealousy, and emerging stronger for having weathered it honestly together. Claire's painting, meanwhile, had grown from a private hobby into something unexpectedly significant. Margaret, the elderly florist who had once sold Daniel his first apology bouquet, mentioned to Claire one afternoon that the small gallery space above her shop had recently become available, its previous tenant having moved away after the summer. On a whim, encouraged by Daniel's persistent enthusiasm, Claire submitted several of her paintings for a small community art showcase held each October in the town square. The night of the showcase arrived crisp and clear, the square filled with string lights and the warm smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor's cart. Claire stood nervously beside her small display of 6 paintings, mostly landscapes of Millbrook rendered in the soft, warm palette she had developed over the past year, watching as townspeople wandered past, pausing occasionally to study her work. Daniel stood beside her throughout the evening, not hovering anxiously the way he might have during the earlier, more insecure months of his transformation, but simply present, genuinely proud, introducing her to colleagues and neighbors with an enthusiasm that had nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with authentic admiration for the woman he had nearly lost through years of careless neglect. "These are remarkable," said a woman Claire did not recognize, studying the largest painting, a rendering of the maple trees along Maple Street bathed in golden autumn light. "Are you a professional artist?" "Just getting started, actually," Claire admitted, feeling a flush of pride she had not expected. "This is my first showcase." "Well, you should consider doing more of these," the woman said, introducing herself as the owner of a small gallery in Ashford. "I'd love to discuss featuring some of your work, if you're interested." Claire exchanged contact information with the gallery owner, her heart racing with a mixture of disbelief and excitement, a feeling she had not experienced in years, the sense of her own potential expanding rather than shrinking beneath the weight of routine and neglect. When the conversation ended, she turned to find Daniel watching her with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. "I'm so proud of you," he said simply, pulling her into a warm embrace amid the soft glow of string lights and the quiet bustle of the community showcase. "I know I don't say that enough, but I am. This is entirely yours, Claire. You built this all on your own." "You helped," Claire said, smiling against his shoulder. "The easel, the encouragement, believing in this before I fully believed in it myself. That mattered too." "Maybe," Daniel conceded. "But the talent, the courage to try again after all those years, that was always you. I just finally got out of the way long enough to let you shine." Later that evening, as the crowds thinned and vendors began packing away their stalls, Claire and Daniel walked slowly through the quiet square, the string lights reflecting softly against the cool evening air. They passed the small coffee shop where Claire had once shared countless conversations with Victor, now closed for the night, its windows dark and peaceful. "Do you ever think about him?" Daniel asked quietly, following her gaze toward the shop. "Victor, I mean." Claire considered the question honestly before answering, no longer afraid of transparency in a marriage that had learned, painfully but thoroughly, the cost of silence and secrecy. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not with regret exactly, more like gratitude. He reminded me of something important at a moment when I desperately needed reminding. I think in a strange way I owe him for helping save our marriage, even though that was never his intention." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing her words without the old defensive tension that once would have accompanied such an admission. "I understand that now," he said. "I spent so long being jealous of him, afraid he represented everything I had failed to be. But I think I finally understand that he wasn't really the threat. My own blindness was the threat. He just happened to be the mirror that showed me what I'd been missing." "That's a healthier way to think about it than you had a year ago," Claire said, smiling gently. "A lot of therapy will do that," Daniel replied with a rueful laugh, and Claire laughed with him, the sound easy and genuine, filling the quiet autumn evening with a warmth that had once felt impossibly distant from their marriage. They continued walking, past the darkened shops and quiet streets of Millbrook, toward the small house on Maple Street that had witnessed both the coldest silences and the warmest reconciliations of their marriage. As they approached their front door, Daniel paused, turning to face Claire beneath the soft glow of the porch light. "I know I can't undo the years I spent not seeing you," he said quietly. "I know jealousy isn't the noblest reason to finally wake up and pay attention, but I'm grateful, every single day, that I did wake up before it was too late. And I promise you, Claire, I will spend every day from now on making sure you never feel invisible again, not because I'm afraid of losing you, but because I finally understand exactly what I have." Claire reached up and gently touched his face, feeling the weight of the past year settle into something resembling genuine peace. "I believe you," she said softly, "and for what it's worth, I'm proud of the man you've worked to become. Not the man who noticed me out of fear, but the man who chose, every single day since, to keep seeing me on purpose." They stood together on the porch for a long moment, the quiet autumn night wrapping around them, before finally stepping inside, closing the door on a difficult chapter that had, against all expectation, led them not toward separation, but toward a deeper, more honest version of the love they had once promised each other years earlier. A love no longer built on routine or neglect, but on the harder, more valuable foundation of truly seeing one another, fully and without fear, at last. In the months that followed, Claire's paintings found a permanent home in the small Ashford Gallery, her work slowly gaining a modest but devoted local following. Daniel attended every showing, standing quietly in the background, never seeking attention for himself, simply present as the steady support of a wife who had finally reclaimed the parts of herself she once believed lost forever. Their marriage, tested by neglect, jealousy, and eventually genuine reflection, had not simply survived the difficult season it endured, but had emerged transformed into something neither of them had believed possible during those quiet, lonely years when Claire had felt like nothing more than a nobody in her own home. And somewhere in Ashford, Victor Hale continued building his own quiet happiness with Lauren, occasionally running into Claire and Daniel at community events. The encounters warm and free of tension, three people who had once been tangled in an uncertain triangle of loneliness and longing, now simply neighbors sharing polite conversation beneath the wide open sky of a small town that had, in its own quiet way, witnessed the slow, difficult, and ultimately rewarding journey of a woman finally being seen for exactly who she was. 2 years after the night Claire first painted alone in a garage transformed by her husband's quiet apology, Millbrook held its spring festival, an event smaller than the harvest celebration, but beloved by locals for its focus on new beginnings, planting season, and the simple joy of warmer days arriving after a long winter. Claire, now recognized around town for her work displayed in the Ashford Gallery, had been invited to lead a small painting workshop for local children in the town square, a request that would have seemed impossible to imagine during the years she spent believing her creative dreams no longer mattered to anyone. She arrived early that morning to set up the folding tables and rows of small canvases, watching as Daniel unloaded boxes of paint supplies from their car without being asked, a quiet partnership that had become so natural between them that neither commented on it anymore. It was simply how they operated now, two people who had learned, through difficult years and honest effort, how to genuinely support one another rather than merely coexist. "Nervous?" Daniel asked, noticing the way Claire's hands moved a little too quickly as she arranged brushes along the table. "A little," she admitted, smiling despite herself. "Teaching children is different from painting alone in the garage." "You'll be wonderful," Daniel said simply, and the confidence in his voice, free of flattery or performance, settled her nerves more than any elaborate reassurance could have. As children began arriving with their parents, filling the square with excited chatter, Claire found her nervousness melting into genuine enjoyment, guiding small hands through basic brushstrokes, praising imperfect efforts with the same patience she had once longed for from Daniel during her own quiet years of self-doubt. She thought briefly of the woman she had been at that first uncomfortable dinner party, invisible and unappreciated, unable to imagine that she would one day stand confidently before a crowd, sharing a passion she had once believed had died entirely. Among the parents watching from the edges of the square, Claire spotted a familiar face, Victor, standing beside a woman with warm brown eyes and an easy smile, a young child holding tightly to both their hands. Lauren, Claire realized, and beside her, a little girl who shared Victor's dark hair and thoughtful expression. "Claire," Victor said warmly, approaching during a brief break in the workshop, "this looks wonderful. You have quite a gift for teaching, in addition to painting." "Thank you," Claire said, genuinely pleased by the compliment, though it no longer carried the complicated weight it once had. "This must be Lauren and your daughter." "Emma," Victor said proudly, gesturing to the little girl who studied Claire with shy curiosity. "She's been asking to learn painting for months. I told her I knew just the person to ask." Lauren extended her hand warmly. "Victor speaks very highly of you and of your work. We'd love for Emma to join your workshop if there's room." "Of course," Claire said, smiling as she knelt down slightly to address the little girl directly. "Would you like to paint something with me today, Emma?" The little girl nodded eagerly, and for the next hour, Claire guided her through simple techniques alongside the other children, occasionally glancing up to see Victor and Lauren watching from nearby, their easy affection for one another evident in small gestures, a hand resting gently on a shoulder, a quiet laugh shared over some small joke. Claire felt no lingering ache watching them, only a warm, settled contentment, gratitude for the unexpected paths that had led each of them to genuine happiness, however winding and uncertain those paths had once seemed. Daniel joined her during the final portion of the workshop, helping distribute finished paintings to proud, paint-smudged children as their parents gathered to collect them. As Emma proudly displayed her simple painting of a yellow sun over green hills, Victor knelt beside his daughter, admiring the work with genuine warmth. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, then glanced up at Claire with a grateful smile. "Thank you for this, truly." "Thank you for bringing her," Claire replied. "It means a lot seeing everyone here today." As the festival wound down that afternoon, Claire and Daniel walked slowly through the square, collecting their supplies, the warm spring sunlight stretching long shadows across the cobblestones. They passed the small bench near the fountain where, years earlier, during the difficult months of rebuilding their marriage, Daniel had first suggested they try attending community events together again, small deliberate steps toward reconnecting with the town and with each other. "Do you remember," Claire said, pausing beside the bench, "when you told me you wanted to keep discovering who I was for as long as I'd let you?" "I remember," Daniel said, sitting down beside her, the fountain's gentle splash filling the comfortable silence between them. "I think you've kept that promise," Claire said softly. "Every single day, actually." Daniel reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, the gesture familiar now, worn smooth by years of genuine partnership rather than forced obligation. "I intend to keep it for the rest of my life," he said. "You deserve nothing less, Claire. You always did. I just needed time and a fair amount of humility to finally understand that." They sat together on the bench as the festival gradually emptied around them, the vendors packing away their stalls, children being gathered by tired but happy parents, the golden afternoon light slowly softening into the warm hues of early evening. Claire thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment, from a woman who felt invisible in her own kitchen, to someone who had rediscovered her voice, her passion, and eventually, her marriage, not through jealousy or fear, but through the harder, more meaningful work of genuine change sustained over years rather than mere seasons. She thought of Victor too, grateful without regret, understanding now that his role in her story had never been about romance destined to bloom, but about reflection, about holding up a mirror at exactly the moment she needed to see her own worth clearly again. He had moved forward into his own happiness, as had she, and the quiet respect between them now felt like proof that some connections exist not to replace what we have, but to remind us what we deserve. As the sun began its slow descent behind the rooftops of Millbrook, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and lavender, Claire leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet comfort of a partnership finally built on solid ground. "I used to think love had to look dramatic to be real," she said quietly. "Grand gestures, passionate declarations, the kind of intensity you read about in stories, but I think I was wrong about that." "What do you think now?" Daniel asked. "I think love looks like this," Claire said, gesturing gently toward the quiet square, the fading light, the steady warmth of his hand in hers. "Ordinary moments, chosen again and again, without needing fear or jealousy to remind you why they matter." Daniel pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head, the gesture simple and unhurried, a small but genuine expression of a love that had finally learned, through difficult years of neglect and painful reflection, how to see clearly rather than merely look. "Then I hope we have many more ordinary moments ahead of us," he said softly. "For the rest of our lives, if you'll have me." Claire smiled, watching the last golden light of the day settle gently over the small town that had witnessed both the coldest silences and the warmest transformations of her life, feeling, at last, entirely and unmistakably seen. "I think," she said, "we already do." And as evening finally fell over Millbrook, the fountain continuing its gentle, endless song behind them, Claire understood that her story had never truly been about jealousy awakening love that should have always existed. It had been about a woman rediscovering that her own worth had never depended on anyone else's attention at all, and about a man learning, slowly and imperfectly, that real love requires not possession or fear, but the daily, deliberate choice to truly see the person standing quietly beside you, long before circumstance forces you to notice what was there, patiently and faithfully all along.